Thank you very much, Madam Chair, esteemed chairs, Mrs. Gressler and Mr. Arthuis, dear colleagues, dear co-rapporteurs. I'll try to be very brief, informing you a little bit more on what is going on with the high-level working group on the own resources, since I think that this debate is very relevant and it has to continue, because it's not only about fixing the current issues with VAT, GNI, etc., etc. I see that the colleagues, and I'm sure that the colleagues from the European Commission, from the Court of Auditors, are doing their best in order to maximize the revenues and make the system working best the way it is designed. The problem is that we have some systemic problem in the composition of the revenues for the European budget, and I would like to concentrate in the next 10 minutes maybe on exactly on that. Why the current system is problematic? Because first we have an unsustainability of the EU policies. To give you examples, now this is the debate on the Juncker plan and how it's going to be financed, because whenever we have some new developments, then there is no room in the European budget to address these developments and to properly finance them. Another example is the youth guarantee that is designed for 2 years for the current MFF, and then there should be a decision how it's going to be continued further, etc., etc. I can continue, and yourself you can continue with a number of policies that don't have secured financing in the European budget the way it is now. Second, we have insecurities in the national budgets. And there is no member state that knows at the beginning of the fiscal year how much it's going to pay next year to the European budget. First, because there is some discrepancy between the fiscal procedures at national and at European level. And second, because there are a number of issues, including the resta liquide, the delayed payments, etc., etc., that over the last years increased the problem of calling additional resources from the national budget. So I'm afraid that there is no country that at the beginning of the year knows how much it's going to contribute to the European budget within the year. And this is a huge problem. And third, this is the increasing problem with the payments, the increasing resta liquide, the increasing amounts due that the Commission is just postponing. They are already decided by the Member States, but what the Commission needs, these are the resources to pay the bills for the respective projects. So the current system is creating a number of instabilities and insecurities. What is the reason? We can speak about many reasons for the current situation, but mostly this is the lack of resources in the national budgets. And because of the lack of resources in the national budgets, the national legislators think about a number of ways to decrease and to minimize their contributions to the European budget. We know that normally within the multi-annual financial framework there is a decision which is taken by the Member States unanimously on the commitments and the payments levels. They know very well what are the amounts due, and at the same time over the years the European budget stays much below the maximum of 1.23% of the GNI, which is decided in the own resources directive some years ago. So the underfinancing of the European budget comes from very understandable reasons, and this is the lack of resources in the national budgets, especially in times of financial difficulties. This leads to nationalization of the policies, of the very wrong debate about the juste retour, and this is not something that I'm going to open here, but many countries are looking for national solutions rather than solutions financed by the European budget in the times of the crisis. And this is an approach which is at least questionable whether this is more efficient. There is a lack of clear visibility of the benefits of the European Union. The Just Retour debate practically ignores a number of values of the European Union that cannot be expressed in monetary terms. So it's very difficult to calculate cash flows in both directions and to make the net position in terms of benefits of any member states. We are debating very much about the different types of sources for the budget, and one of the problems is that the GNI-based resource, which is supposed to be an additional one, which was supposed to be an additional one when it was invented, is practically now covering the vast bulk of the European payments now. But the problem is not only about the small percentage of the genuine own resources. We see that there are some questions about the calculation and some methodological questions in terms of calculating the VAT and the GNI also. There is a huge problem with the transparency in the system of financing the EU budget. I would say that it's, including to people that are working with the European budget, it's very difficult to explain clearly in some understandable language how much every citizen and why she or he is paying to the European budget. The system is not efficient at the time, and it lacks the ability and the flexibility to meet new developments. There was a proposal which I'm sure is going to come on the table of the European Parliament related to the Eurozone budget. There was a CCI, an instrument which was devised by the Barroso Commission. Whether this is going to be this one or something else, and I think there are a number of issues to be discussed here. The sustainability of the single currency zone, of course, needs to tackle budgetary issues, and as we have seen during the last crisis, the European budget is not fit to meet these problems. How can the problems eventually be solved? Because we all see that the current system is not sustainable, it's not transparent, it's not a system which brings confidence into the member states and the national budgets. First, and this is something that the high-level group on the own resources is going to introduce in its final report. This is to try to answer to several principles of the European budget: simplicity, transparency, equity, and democratic accountability. This is any budget has to answer to these principles, including the European budget. Additional to that, we need to look for the particularities of the European Union, which means a focus on the European added value, and to constrain the narrow self-interests, to take into consideration the subsidiarity principle and the fiscal sovereignty of the member states, something that Mr. Lewandowski just mentioned. Of course, there is no transfer of fiscal competencies with the changing of the financing of the European budget, and there is no attempt to, in a hidden way, to increase the European budget. We are speaking about a more autonomous European budget, not about a larger European budget. So this also has to be taken into consideration. We need to guarantee that the national governments keep the control on the European budget, whatever new resources are figured out. Now we have at least 3 consent procedures, so okay, 3 procedures where national governments, might not be only consent, give their green light to the budget. With the multi-annual financial framework, with the annual budget, and very often with additional payments that are due during the year. So it's absolutely not needed to have 3 decisions of the member state for the same amounts that are to be contributed to the European budget. If we squeeze it to 1 decision, which is of course unanimity, it's not going to harm the potential of the member states to control what is happening with the European budget. Second, another thing is to create a genuine fiscal instrument also to be used in the Eurozone. I'm leaving this aside, although within the debates in the high-level group on the own resources, this was raised several times by experts, because we have to look a little bit further and see that the European budget is going to have additional functions and additional needs. Also, what is very important is that we need to assure a steady flow of more independent, genuine own resources. There is also a debate whether the GNI-based resources are a genuine own resource. I have seen some member states arguing for that, saying the GNI-based contribution is an own resource to the European budget. Yes, but if it was an own resource, then the European Union would have some more powers on this budget, and now it doesn't have any. So practically, it goes only through the national decisions. Whatever new instruments are invented, and I'm finishing now, I'm going to touch some of the potential candidates for new revenues, we end up with a very sensitive question about the rebates. And this is what poisons the whole discussion. I'm absolutely sure that member states and legislators in the member states and at European level would see the benefits of changing the current system into a system where the European budget is more autonomous and which is a smoother fiscal system. The problem is that you have a number of rebates and different exceptions in the European budget that are absolutely inexplicable. There is no way to explain them. They are simply a result of power game within the European Council. So many member states are not ready to raise whatever question, including the VAT simplification, which I think was a very sensible proposal of the European Commission with the last MFF, because it's linked to the calculation of the UK rebate. So whatever we think, we end up with the question of rebates, and this is indeed the part of the whole debate that has to be considered. There was a wise proposal of the European Commission with the last MFF. It was not accepted, to change the debate with lump sums and gradually to phase it out. You can understand why most of the member states rejected that without giving any reason, because there is no reason that could be given for the rebates. Finally, what are the candidates for the potential additional resources? Of course, I think that we have to focus on areas where the European Union is creating additional value. So it makes sense to tax if the Union is creating more wealth. So to tax this wealth in order to use these funds and to further invest into increasing the potential of the market. Of course, the custom duties are something which exists, and VAT that has to be simplified, definitely, and it's much better to simplify than to enter into the discussion of regressive taxing. I know that some of the poorer member states would be taxed higher with that, but still I think it's better than this absolutely, again, non-understandable system of calculation of VAT resources. There is an additional value that might be created eventually by the digital market. Mr. Rubik suggested the spectrum policy. I'm afraid that the spectrum policy and eventually assigning some frequencies to the European budget cannot exactly work, because in some member states they are already sought, and this is revenue for the national budgets, and this is already happening in most of the European countries. So it's done, it's gone. So the frequencies are not there available. But again, the creation of additional wealth by the single market in digital in the digital economy could be a candidate. The CO2 emissions were mentioned, again with the reservations that Janusz also suggested. The FTT was also a good idea, especially in the way that the Commission suggested that. It is not an additional, I mean, there is no debate, and this is, I would disagree with Mr. Lewandowski, whether this is a European resource or national resource. It is a national resource, but directing two-thirds, as the Commission suggested, to the European budget, that means to lower the national contributions to the budget. So the net effect is finally happening in the national budgets, not in the European budget, but it makes the budget more autonomous. So there are very good reasons to think about this type of taxing. Of course, we are continuing our work, and in the next sessions and meetings of the high-level group on the own resources, we are going to start exactly with considering the pluses and minuses of different candidates for additional resources. Final sentence and the message, if I could convey this message: the current system is not good. It's not good from the national point of view. It's not good for the European budget. We need to change it, and there are ways to change it. But this discussion has to be really a political discussion, because many member states just keep the discussion at expert level, which doesn't allow to take appropriate political decisions. That's why the European Parliament and the national parliaments could be very important factors in this debate. Thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur Kalfin. Merci, vos observations.
Thank you, Mr. Kalfin. I think we have a lot of understanding of what you said just now. And indeed, I don't know how it is for Budgetary Control Committee members, but for us in the Budgets Committees, it's difficult when we go back to our constituencies to explain what we do. It's really tricky. And the citizenry at large really wonders about the fiscal link. You pay a tax to the local authority. You think that's where you live. You're a member of that community. But for the EU, that's harder. Anyway, no additional taxes. Do you have a few minutes, Mr. Kalfin, to answer questions? You do? Thank you. Mr. Monka.
Ďakujem, ja som spokojný s tým, čo povedal pán Kalfin.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to have listened to Mr. Kalfin. I'm very happy what he said. But there's one thing I'd say. The CO2 tax, and this is something Mr. Lewandowski spoke about, it was basically dual taxation. Perhaps this is perhaps here it's useful to mention the Swedish example. Outside the European Union, this kind of tax doesn't really exist. Now, on double taxation, I really would like this example to be looked at carefully. I mean, do we really want this? I mean, there are many people who advocate this tax, academics among them, but we've got to really look about the practical implementability of this. Mr. Zeller. Thanks very much. I think Mr. Kalfin has correctly identified the problems, and the fact of the matter is we don't have a lot of time to find a solution. This morning we had difficulties that we discussed about the structural funds and regional policies. There are bills from the previous program period to the tune of 20 billion, and N+2, N+3 rule is still in place, so individual member states can, as they did previously, can present their accounts up to 2013. So they still got this time frame, a year and a half into the new program period. And we need a financial foundation. Now, this is one of the biggest areas we spend our money, and we've lost time because we needed this leeway to pay off our bills, but basically we're pushing this off to 2019, to the end of this programming period. And we got involved in making the mistake because we conceded to Council. And there's this gap between commitments and payments, 50 billion. There's a 50 billion gap. So we're pushing off this massive amount of payments for the future. We're kicking it into the long grass, and yet Council comes up with new commitments, macro-financial assistance for Ukraine, increase of funding to address the refugee crisis, and any number of other things as a response to current events. But there's no financial basis for this in the current budget. We can't afford it. So I think 2016 and that budget is going to be a critical year. Can we deliver on the commitments in the European budget? That's going to be the question. Or is it impossible to do so? And I think we've got to be honest that this has to stop. The current system is going to lead to a crisis between what we promised and what we can actually deliver in real terms. Now, this is particularly the case because there are member states and regions that are in pre-financing are waiting for repayments 1-2 years further down the line. So they lose any interest to get involved in any European projects in the light of this experience, because the funding it has not been clear and there's been so much uncertainty. Mr. Arthuis, I see no further requests for the speaking time, but if I may, I'll say something. Now, the own resources you've imagined. Now, we had one in the past, customs levy. It accounted for 50% prior to enlargement. But free trade agreements are being negotiated. So levies have decreased gradually and only account for 10%. Environmental restrictions are imposed, rightly so, and that increased production costs within the European Union. And we allow products in that weren't subject to the same restrictions in the countries where they're manufactured. So under these circumstances, is it entirely far-fetched to have a kind of carbon tax on imports at the EU's external borders? Now somebody say, well, this is protectionism. But come on, we want to create jobs too. We want to put in place the conditions so that that people invest in Europe, and we want Europe to remain competitive, to be able to compete with this market. So is it crazy to imagine a carbon tax on imports from third countries? And as for funding, we're in a bit of a pickle. At the best of Mr. Juncker, a European fund has been conceived for strategic investments. The guarantee will be funded by a levy, basically, on the Connecting Europe facility and Horizon 2020. And many of us in the European Parliament feel very frustrated about this, and we need to find some kind of decent solution to this. Mr. Kalfin, to wind up, thank you very much for being so kind as to come along. I think we're abusing a bit.
I'm very sympathetic, and I think I'm not the only one, to impose some carbon taxes on the imported goods, especially if we impose taxes on domestic production. Definitely we need to do it for imported goods, because otherwise we create arbitrage in terms of environment, and we create better conditions outside of the European Union for production. Of course, this has to be very carefully checked with the international trade agreements that the European Union has, but this is certainly one of the candidates that we are going to consider. And you're right, Mr. President, that in terms of constraints in the European budget, whatever magnificent plan we have, being the Plan Juncker, which I find very useful, whatever other plan, we just refigure the same amounts and try to make more things with the same money, which I think we cannot stretch the efficiency of this money far enough. So we clearly have to give up with something and to introduce another policy, which is contradicting the whole idea of 7 years plans. And with this particular one, where we have for the first time in the existence of the European Union a decrease in the funds, the flexibility is really brought to a minimum. So whatever comes, Mr. Zeller mentioned the refugees, that's the same thing. I mean the earthquake in Nepal, and we see what is happening there. I mean the calls for European solidarity are also increasing. All these are things that cannot be foreseen when the budget is adopted. So either we create more flexibility or we create a procedure to kind of change the priorities in the budget, which is not possible under the current budgetary procedure. Otherwise, the commitments and the payments, indeed, there is this gap. This gap is one of the mechanisms not to go into deficit with the European budget, but practically we create deficit with the delayed payments. So they can be pushed from one year to another. That would be fine if the amounts are the same, but when the amounts are increasing, then this is worrying, because that means that the whole process is not is getting out of control. So it's I wouldn't say that this is a solution. So definitely not only new resources, but maybe, and there is the revision of the MFF coming up for the European Parliament. I think that there are important issues that could be considered in terms of procedures and ways the multi-annual budget is adopted. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Kalfin.
Thank you, Mr. Kalfin. What you said is very encouraging for us as MEPs, and we will doubtless have to come forward and express with perhaps a greater degree of bluntness what we want from governments. I mean, we really want things to move forward, and we want to head towards a real European budget. You mentioned the Eurozone. What about the European as financial stability mechanism? Isn't it really as the sort of beginnings of a budget? We are sort of mutualizing excessive debt, aren't we?
You mutualize debts, but the problem in the Eurozone, like in any single currency zone, this is with the fiscal transfers. Something that I know that many member states do not want to open this issue, but indeed it happens. I think that some of these transfers could be done within the European budget. So my personal understanding is that this has to be part of the European budget, which is going to be triggered only when it is needed, but only with debt management it's not possible to make it. I mean, you have to make transfers also. If you ask the member states to keep very stringent fiscal conditions.
Nous ressentons chez vous une forme de complicité.
Well, you sort of want to be our accomplice in getting things moving forward, don't you? And we're very grateful to you for that. Thank you very much for coming along, and thank you for what you've said. That's really very encouraging to move towards more integration. Let's move to conclusions, and now let's give the floor to the